Welcome to the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production. For transcriptions, show notes, and extras, please visit us at theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. Now, broadcasting across the world from the heart of the American Bible Belt, here is your host, Michael B. Rush.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Black Swan Rising podcast. This is your host, Michael B. Rush. We have been talking about some interesting things on the podcast so far, so let's recap the first two episodes real quick. This podcast is about Black Swan events. Black Swan events are events that are undetectable in advance because of normalcy bias. However, once they happen, they shatter paradigms across the entire spectrum. Nothing is ever the same once a Black Swan event occurs. And lastly, once a Black Swan event has occurred, it becomes obvious in retrospect, looking at the available evidence, that something like this was always going to happen. So the premise of this podcast is, if we have eyes to see, can we look at the available evidence today and predict these Black Swan events in advance? And I believe that yes, we can. Now, last episode number 2, I began discussing the UFO phenomenon and how Congress is having, congressional hearings on this. They're bringing in high credibility witnesses that are talking about incredible things that are happening above our most secure airspace on a daily basis. In fact, in Congress's official literature, they're talking about these things increasing at an exponential rate. Therefore, if we put our Black Swan goggles on and we ask ourselves, listen, if this is real, if this stuff is really happening in the world around us, how does it reconcile with our religious beliefs? Because there's not a whole lot of people out there that are tackling these subjects holistically from the Judeo-Christian background that I am planning on doing with this podcast. So with that brief review, let's jump on in to this episode where we are going to continue discussing the UFO phenomenon. And I'd like to begin today's discussion by talking about a message that was sent in 1974, and it's called the Arecibo message. Now, Carl Sagan, the famous scientist, was part of SETI, which stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Now, he designed a message that they were going to beam into space using 20 trillion watts. That is one powerful message. Now, the message was comprised of 1,670 binary digits. Now, why 1,670? Because 1,670 is the product of two prime numbers, 73 and 23. The idea was that any intelligent species that was receiving this message would be able to deduce that it was the product of two prime numbers, which would then hopefully cause them to align the message into 73 rows of 23 digits wide. And if you did this, it would create a graphical image. And the graphical image ingeniously included at the top of it a cipher, a numeric cipher for the digits 0 to 9. And then underneath it, it broke out all kinds of different information based off of that cipher. For example, it showed the most common elements on Earth. It showed the number of nucleotides in our DNA. It showed graphically the double helix. It showed an image of a man and how tall the man was and how many inhabitants were on the Earth at that point in time. It showed a graphical representation of the solar system with Earth, the third planet from the sun, being elevated to highlight that, hey, this is where we live. It also included a graphical representation of the Arecibo telescope in Chile that broadcast this message. Now, SETI thought, hey, we're going to send this out here. No one's going to get it for a very long time because it has to travel many light years to the nearest star system. However, lo and behold, on August 2001, there was an incredibly strange crop circle known as the Chilbolton Radio Telescope crop circle that appeared next to the Chilbolton radio in England. Now, I'm going to include an image of this crop circle so that you can see it in the show notes. But this image exactly mirrored the Arecibo message that was sent out in 1974. However, there were some very interesting differences. For example, the image, rather than being human-looking in appearance, it included an image that looked just like a classical gray alien. It also showed their numbers as being some 20 billion, and it showed that silicon was a major important component into their biological structure. It also showed an image of the device that was used to send their message, and it looks nothing like a radio telescope. So it was very interesting. Now, this appeared overnight, and you'll see by the image that it's a pretty intricate crop circle. Now, 1 year later, another crop circle appeared in the same field. They call this one the Chilbolton 2 crop circle. Now, this crop circle was different from the first one. It included a massive picture of a classic gray alien, and then next to the classical gray alien, there was a massive disk. Now, this disk included binary code that started in the center and swirled out from there. And upon examination, it was discovered that the binary code lined up with a binary system known as ASCII 2. And when you take ASCII 2, you could decipher that meaning, and this is what the message said. Beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Much pain, but still time. Believe there is good out there. We oppose deception. Conduit closing. Now, that is a very interesting message. And again, I'm going to include a picture of this crop circle so you can see it. I mean, it's remarkable. Again, this appeared overnight in this field next to the Chilbolton radio telescope. Now, every single crop circle that has ever been discovered is immediately debunked by everybody. However, if we are trying to have eyes to see, we'd have to at least have an open mind to the possibility that maybe this isn't fake. Maybe this isn't a hoax. Maybe this is a legitimate response to the message that we shot out into the cosmos. Now, along those lines, there is another very curious event that transpired in June of 2015. This was reported by Linda Moulton Howe, who is a Peabody Award-winning journalist. I think that she does an incredible job documenting all of the stories that I have seen her put out. Now, the story is pretty incredible. It's about an Army officer that she calls Sergeant CJ. And Sergeant CJ says that on June 29th of 2015, he and his family were traveling from Savannah, Georgia to Fort Carlson, Colorado. Now, according to Sergeant CJ, while they were driving, the entire family saw an incredible light in the sky that descended until it was hovering right above their vehicle. And they could clearly see that this wasn't just a light, it was a structured craft. And the next thing they know, they are 250 miles off course, and they have no idea how they got there. And I mean, they're totally freaked out. They're in, I believe, Paducah, Kentucky. Now, being freaked out, they pull off the road to the nearest hotel, which happened to be a Motel 6. and they get a room and they're just trying to make sense of what just happened. Now, the family goes to bed, and Sergeant CJ's wife wakes up in the middle of the night to find her husband in a trance-like state, frantically writing down on the back of their Motel 6 receipt, which was like an 8 by 11 sheet of paper, a bunch of squares and lines. And he fills essentially the entire piece of paper up. And I'll include a copy of that piece of paper in the show notes to episode 3, so you can look at that as well. And he had no idea what he was doing, but he said that there was a sense of urgency for him to write these symbols down, even though he didn't know what they meant. And he said that he could see the symbols scrolling across his vision in like a bluish, purplish light. And he couldn't relax until he had written them all down. And it was such a disturbing experience, especially on the heels of their missing time and seeing a massive spacecraft hover above their vehicle, that he contacted Linda Moulton Howe for help in trying to figure out what in the heck was going on. Now, Linda was aware of another military man who had had a similar experience, and she was aware that they discovered that the code was a form of ASCII binary code. So she contacted a scientist in Australia who had helped out this previous military man who had experienced a similar thing. The scientist's name was Dr. Horace Drew. And she sent this, a copy of this page to Dr. Drew to figure out. And he quickly figured out that it was ASCII 2, just like the Gibolton 2 crop circle that I mentioned previously. Now, using that ASCII 2, this is what the characters that he wrote down on the back of this Motel 6 receipt say. Continuous protection of humanity, 49.27N, 11.5E. Expose hidden knowledge to all citizens. Advancement imperative for planetary survival. Beware of Orion 1350.3 and Z Reticuli 39.17. That was the message. Now, the scientist figured that the 49.7N and 11.5E were actually coordinates. And when he looked those coordinates up, it pointed to Nuremberg, Germany. Now, Linda Moulton Howe was not quite sure why it was pointing to Nuremberg, Germany. She assumed it was pointing there because that's where the Nazi war crimes trials were held, in Nuremberg. However, something incredible happened in Nuremberg, Germany, that has become known as the Nuremberg celestial phenomenon. Now, given the message says continuous protection of humanity and then points to this location, I think that if this is a legitimate message, and Linda Moulton Howe, she's no hack. I don't believe that she's lying about this. So we're left to either assume that Sergeant CJ is lying, or this is legit. And if this is legit, this is incredibly important. So what happened with this Nuremberg celestial phenomenon? Well, apparently, and we have a record of this because a newspaper in Nuremberg, Germany, published an account on a woodcutting, and we still have that woodcutting today. And I'm going to include a copy of that woodcutting, and we actually have surviving newspaper copies of this that I will include in the show notes to this episode. And you're going to want to look at this because it is mind-blowing. So I'm going to read to you an English translation of the newspaper that was published describing this celestial event that took place over the skies of Nuremberg, Germany. Here goes. In the morning of April 14th, 1561, at daybreak, between 4 and 5 a.m. Now, I'm going to pause here and just explain to you something very interesting. The portable timepiece was invented in Nuremberg, Germany, and it was invented in 1504. So that's approximately 60 years prior to this event. So the fact that they say that this occurred between 4 and 5 a.m. is probably highly likely that it actually did occur because people had watches at this time, clocks. Now, it's also interesting to note that sunrise in Nuremberg, Germany on April 14th, 1561 would not have occurred until after 6 o'clock, 6:30 a.m. to be precise. So keep that in mind as we continue. Now I'm going back. So let me just start over. In the morning of April 14th, 1561, at daybreak, between 4 and 5 a.m., a dreadful apparition occurred on the sun. And then this was seen in Nuremberg in the city, before the gates and in the country, by many men and women. At first, there appeared in the middle of the sun 2 blood-red semicircular arcs, just like the moon in its last quarter. And in the sun, above and below on both sides, the color was blood. And there stood a round ball of partly dull, partly black ferrous color. Likewise, there stood on both sides, and, as a torus about the sun, such blood-red ones, and other balls in large number, about 3 in a line and 4 in a square, also some alone. In between these globes there were visible a few blood-red crosses, between which there were blood-red strips, becoming thicker to the rear and in the front malleable like the rods of reed grass, which were intermingled amongst them 2 big rods, one on the right and another on the left, and within the small and big rods there were 3 and also 4 and more globes. These all started fighting amongst themselves, so that the globes, which were first in the sun, flew out to the one standing on both sides. Thereafter the globes standing outside the sun and in the small and large rods flew into the sun. Besides, the globes flew back and forth amongst themselves and fought vehemently with each other for over an hour. And when the conflict in and again out of the sun was most intense, they became fatigued to such an extent that they all fell from the sun down upon the earth, as if they all burned. And then they wasted away upon the earth in immense smoke. After all of this, there was something like a black spear, very long and thick-sided, and the shaft pointed towards the east and the point to the west. Whatever such signs mean, God alone knows. Although we have seen, shortly one and after another, many kinds of signs on the heavens, which are sent to us by Almighty God, to bring us to repentance, we still are, unfortunately, so ungrateful that we despise such high signs and miracles of God, or we speak of them with ridicule and discard them to the wind, in order that God may send us a frightening punishment on account of our ungratefulness. After all, the God-fearing will by no means discard these signs, but will take it to heart as a warning of their merciful Father in heaven, and will mend their lives and faithfully beg God that he may avert his wrath, including the well-deserved punishment, on us, so that we may temporarily here and permanently there live as his children. For it, may God grant us his help. Amen. By Hans Glasser, letter painter of Nuremberg. Okay. Let's unpack this a little bit. When you look at the actual newsprint of this, you get a far better description of what is actually transpiring. And you see basically these cigar-shaped objects that are filled with these orbs. And the orbs fly out from the cigar-shaped objects and they start battling with each other. And they appear to be coming in and out of the sun. However, keep in mind that this transpired sometime between 4 and 5 a.m. The sun hadn't actually risen, nor would it, for another hour and a half. So this wasn't the sun that these things were flying in and out of. It was another massive star-like object that was as large as the sun, from their perspective, in the sky above Nuremberg. They also talked about this black spear that appeared in the heavens. Now, in the depiction, This spear-like craft is bigger than the entire city of Nuremberg. It's massive. You really need to look at this depiction. Now, there is no normal, naturally occurring phenomenon that can account for things like this flying around and fighting with each other and then exploding and falling down onto the ground and setting their fields ablaze. This is incredible. More incredible still is the fact that whoever gave Sergeant CJ this ASCII 2 message was referencing this event as evidence that they were continuously protecting humanity. This is very reminiscent of the kings of heaven that came to protect Israel from the 900 mysterious chariots of iron that the Canaanites had. The same iron chariots that neither Joshua nor Caleb could overcome, despite being filled with the power of God. Now that is some incredible stuff. Okay, so this gets us through the first part of Sergeant CJ's message, the part that gave the coordinates to Nuremberg, Germany, and said that these folks were the continuous protectors of humanity. Now, the next part of the message said, expose hidden knowledge to all citizens. Presumably, this means that there is knowledge that is being suppressed by somebody about this whole phenomenon. And if you've been watching some of those Senate hearings or the congressional hearings, you definitely get the feel that there is some of these, black project groups that have information on this that they are withholding from everyone else. The next line says, advancement imperative for planetary survival. It doesn't really say what advancement means. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that we need both technological advancement, but probably more importantly, spiritual advancement, because I believe that there are some trials coming our way. And in fact, that seems to be kind of the indication of the last sentence, which says, beware of Orion 1350.3 and Z Reticuli 39.17. Now, this is referring to the Orion star system. The 1350.3 refers to the fact that Orion is 1350.3 light years from Earth, and Zeta Reticuli is 39.17 light years from Earth. Now, this reminds me of the conversation that we talked about in the last episode between the Lord and Job, wherein the Lord asked Job if he could bind Orion, meaning the negative influence of Orion. And also the Lord mentioned to Job about the sweet influence that the Pleiades has had. Now, curiously enough, the Pleiades star system, that is one of the stars that is mentioned as belonging to this Galactic Federation. So curious that the Lord would have said that the Pleiades star system was influencing the Earth in a positive way, but that Orion was negatively influencing the Earth and that he bound Orion as a result. Now we have this message that is telling us that we should beware of the Orion star system, meaning the inhabitants of the Orion star system and of the star system orbiting Zeta Reticuli. That's curious. Also, you will recall from the prior episode, episode 2, that in the book of Enoch, Enoch mentioned that the watchers would be bound for 70 generations, but that they would once again be upon the earth during the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and that they would be corrupting the earth just as it had been corrupted before the great flood. This seems to be what this message that was recorded in this incredible crop circle is referencing. So this is, something to think about. It seems to be, again, in alignment with some of these curious scriptures that we have reviewed hitherto. But this isn't it. There's actually more. Within a week, on the other side of the world, in Turin, Italy, which is a town of about 600,000, right outside of the airport, right where the planes come in to land over the runways, there is a large field. And miraculously, in the night, this incredibly intricate crop circle appears, known as the Turin crop circle. Again, I'm going to include a copy of this. You've got to see this in the show notes. This is a mind-boggling crop circle. And the crop circle also contains ASCII to binary code embedded within the image. And when you translate this binary message, it translates into Timeo et ferentes, which literally translates into beware the coming ET, and is a spin off of the well-known phrase Timeo danos et dona ferentes, which means beware Greeks bearing gifts. If you remember back to the Chibolton 2 message that said, beware the ETs bearing false gifts and their broken promises. This seems to be a similar message. What does all of this mean? If this is real, it has to reconcile with the gospel of Jesus Christ. If it's fake, if this is all some elaborate hoax, what's the point? I mean, you look at some of these crop circles and they're mind-boggling to be done in pitch black. Now, clearly some crop circles are fake, but the easiest way to debunk something is to create something fake and say, look at this is fake, therefore everything is fake. However, the thing that gives me pause is when you have good, God-fearing people that swear up and down that they are having these kinds of experiences that just kind of blow your socks off. And how can they be reconciled with this? I have a really hard time having someone as credible as Brigadier General Haim Eshed, who says, listen, Israel and the United States have been working with an organization called the Galactic Federation for 30 years. And it's real. He says, I know it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. So I think that is really interesting. Might it not be this Galactic Federation, if these things are real, that is intervening and trying to warn us of a potential black swan event that may be coming our way? To this end, there was a very, very interesting call into a radio program called Evident Footprints. This is a program that is sponsored by the BBC, or at least it's aired by the BBC radio. And you can still listen to it Monday to Friday, 10 p.m. Pacific time. Now, on May 29th, 2029, there was a very interesting caller that called into the program, who was being hosted at the time by Don Nickelhoff and a guest host by the name of Jim Murray. Now, they received a call from a man who purported himself to be a general in the Galactic Federation and called himself General Jeremiah. Now, the things that he talked about in this interview, and I'm going to include the interview in the show notes so that you can read it yourself. I'll try to get a copy of it so you can listen to it yourself if you would like. But it was just bonkers because General Jeremiah said that they have been here for 30 years and they have been monitoring the earth, and they intervene once in a while when things get dire to try to keep us from killing ourselves. But the interesting thing, and there were lots of interesting things in this interview, but one of the most interesting things to me from the Judeo-Christian perspective is that General Jeremiah said that the Federation was comprised of 574 different planets, all from this galaxy, who had the common belief in Jesus Christ. In fact, they said that each of their planets had been visited by and ministered to by Jesus Christ himself. And that they are very interested in this planet, and they hope that this planet will be joining the Federation in the near future. Now, another interesting thing that General Jeremiah said in the interview was that all of the people from these 574 different planets were all very human in appearance. He said that they differed from one another maybe by their shade of skin color or eyes or different things like this, kind of like how the different races on Earth differ from each other. But that everybody was clearly human and created in the image of God. Now, that does not mean that there are not individuals out there throughout the cosmos that are not created in the image of God. We've been speaking about some of the grays, for instance, which are, they seem to be created in the image of man and not in the image of God. But it's a curious phenomenon. Now, as a little side note here, I actually was approached by somebody. I've written a bunch of books. I've written 7 different books, and I had someone approach me who had read one of my books, and in it I talked about this from definitely from a religious perspective. And this person who I did not know contacted me and said, "Listen, I've just finished your book, and you need to talk with my friend. He has some experiences that you're going to want to hear." So I met with this individual. This individual has been highly involved in politics throughout his career. I remember actually seeing him on TV once, and he talked about things that were basically just as crazy sounding as what Brigadier General Haim Eshed was saying. But this man claimed to have been interacting with people that were not from this world for the past 30 years or so. And he said that he had been with them on their ships. He had left the planet before. He had seen Earth from space. And one of the things that he commented on was how many different groups are coming here and that they are all very human in appearance. He did say that, the Greys are totally real and that he has had interactions with them as well, but they're apart from this human-looking category of people that exist throughout the cosmos that are created in the image of God. And he told me about a conversation that he was having with some of these people. And he asked them, "Why are there so many of you here on Earth? What's the big deal?" And he said that the person he was talking to responded to him and said, "Are you a religious man?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he says, "What do you learn about in Sunday school?" And he said, "Jesus And then this person said, "What do you think we learn about in Sunday school?" And the man said, "Jesus." And then he said, What do you learn about Jesus? Do you learn about where he grew up and Jerusalem and the things that he did there?" And this man that I met said, "Yeah." And then this fellow said, "If you had the opportunity to go and see those places where Jesus lived and walked and taught, would you want to?" And he said, "Yeah, of course." He said, "Well, don't you think that those civilizations in the world or in the universe who have the capability of coming here wouldn't want to do the same thing? Because Jesus Christ isn't just your savior. His atonement just wasn't for your sins. It was for all the sins of every man, woman, and child throughout the universe. That's why you're being visited by so many people." And it just blew this guy's mind because, frankly, there are not many boxes like that for traditional Christianity. But this sounds to be exactly like what General Jeremiah is saying, independent of what this man that I met, I met him back during COVID, what he was saying. And it sounds very similar to what Haim Ashed is saying. So, and frankly, there's lots of other people who have had similar experiences. Now, another mind-boggling thing that General Jeremiah said in this interview was that they are not the only people interested in the earth. He said that there is another group that is hostile towards them. And he referred to them as, and I know that this sounds totally crazy, but I'm just going to say it because this guy said it. This isn't me saying this stuff. Okay. This is other people. I'm just trying to reconcile this with, Christianity. So this guy, General Jeremiah, said that there's this group of what he referred to as reptilian type beings that are humanoid in appearance, but they are hostile. And he said that on one of their patrols, and he says that they are sending thousands of crafts to the Earth every single day, and that they have a massive mothership that's orbiting the planet and has been for 30-something years. And their ship contains approximately 26,000 people from all of these different Federation planets, and they're monitoring us. And that on one of their routine monitoring trips, they came across a craft that had broken down in the middle of New Mexico. And there was one of these reptilian beings on it. And they went down and got this man, and they spent 3 days with him. And he said that his name was General Galactic. And this General Jeremiah says that General Galactic, who is the reptilian being, was more familiar with our scriptures than anyone he had ever encountered. And he said that the prophets from their world had warned them that Earth was about to be completely converted to Christianity, and that they were to try to stop this from happening at all costs. And that's what they were doing. And General Galactic said that they were working with many of the governments on the earth, or factions within those governments, that were willingly helping them accomplish their objectives. Now, this is really interesting because I said that this happened in 2009, and General Galactic told them at that time that they thought that the universal conversion of the earth to Christianity would happen within 30 years. So we're talking about something that is going to happen before the year 2040, according to this reptilian being. And I realize that this is totally bonkers sounding, but there are all kinds of people that are talking about interactions with these kinds of folks. Now, General Jeremiah said that he would take some of his ships and that they would come down and meet with Don Nickelhoff and the, guest host Jim Murray in person and show them their ships and show them some of their technology, which apparently is powered by dark matter, if I recall correctly. And, Jim Murray was a scientist and he was very interested in seeing this. And both of those men, Don and Jim, signed affidavits saying that this man and some scientists from his ship did indeed come down and they saw their ships and were able to inspect them. And these are good, God-loving men. So you're left to say, well, they're just lying. They're doing this to try to get more people to listen to their radio program or, whatever. You can say that, but these men are adamant that what they're saying is true. And if what they are saying is true, it sounds an awful lot like what Brigadier General Haim Eshed, a Jewish man, is saying is taking place. And I find it hard to believe that, Haim Eshed is lying, given his background. And I think that this is just something that, we need to think about. So based off of this, there is this Galactic Federation, which is comprised of Christian planets that believe the same gospel as we do, that are very interested in this planet because they understand that there is going to be a wholesale conversion to Christianity, an event that I can only suppose is correlated with the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, from a biblical perspective, we know that before the great and terrible day of the Lord, there will be a great deception that will take place. And if you're reading in between the lines here, it would seem that this reptilian race of beings, however, and it sounds totally crazy for those words to even be coming out of my mouth. But again, these aren't my ideas here. I am just parroting these things that other men are saying, and it's up to you to decide for yourself whether you believe this or not. But whether you believe it or not, you have to come up with some reconciliation and some alternate explanation for why Congress is saying that our skies are literally filled with crafts from other worlds. We are living in fascinating times, and I think that we better start taking some of this stuff a little more seriously than we do, because if there's even a modicum of truth to this, I think we are in for some very, very interesting times ahead. Now, this brings me to another very interesting person and some of the experiences that this man has been having. And I am speaking of a man by the name of Chris Bledsoe. Now, Chris Bledsoe, he's another very Christian man, although some of his beliefs that have been, they have been greatly influenced by some of the experiences that he has been having. And I want to share his experiences with you because to me, they are very alarming, and we need to start forming the theological framework for some of these things, because according to him, some events are going to begin to happen as early as Easter of next year, 2026, that will revolutionize the world. And depending on your perspective, these could be very concerning from a Judeo-Christian perspective. So what are the experiences that Chris Bledsoe has had? Well, Chris Bledsoe's experiences began around the time of this Evident Footprint broadcast, back in 2009. So Chris Bledsoe, if you recall, in that time period, we were going through the housing crisis, the toxic loan crisis, the 2008 financial crisis. It's known by a bunch of different names. But Chris Bledsoe was a contractor, and he had built just hundreds of homes, and he was getting hammered by this. He was doing very well prior to this, but was losing everything. And so he was just, out of his mind in anxiety as a result of, all of the pressures that he was feeling, watching all of his subdivisions going under and so forth. And some of his friends wanted to provide some sort of, pressure release for him to kind of decompress and just, forget about his financial concerns for a few hours at least. So they decided they were going to take him fishing. And so they went out to the Cape Fear River in North Carolina and went fishing. And Chris, along with his friends, brought his 17-year-old son, Chris Jr. Now, Chris he just couldn't get the anxiety out of his mind. So if you've ever felt anxiety of this magnitude, you just can't sit still. You're just overcome with anxiety. And that's what he was feeling. He couldn't sit and, watch the river roll by. He had to be up. And he said, guys, I got to go for a walk. So he goes out for a walk. And as he's walking through the North Carolina woods, he begins to feel as if he's being watched. And he's hearing things behind him, and he just has an odd feeling. And so he starts making his way towards a field because he can't see who's behind him because there's so many trees. So he goes into this field that he's aware of, and to his shock, he sees an orb that appears to be the sun, but it's moving in the sky. And in fact, it descends into the field where he's at, and he looks behind him, and out from the tree line step these black beings that would physically be described as your classical gray alien, except for they're not gray at all. They're jet black, and their eyes are glowing red. Now, to me, that is super creepy and is a warning sign that these guys aren't good. But Chris, he loses consciousness. And the next thing that he knows, it's dark and he's lying on his back in this field, and the orb is gone. And so are these little black guys with the glowing red eyes. So he jumps up and he runs back to his friends. And his friends, of course, are freaking out because Chris has been gone a long time, and they've been searching for him. And in fact, his 17-year-old son is still missing. He's out there looking for his dad. And so Chris begins to panic because he remembers these little black guys with the glowing red eyes, and he's worried about his son. So he takes off looking for his son. And soon he hears his son crying. And so he follows the voice and sees his son curled up in the fetal position on the ground underneath some bushes. And he starts trying to comfort his son, and his son starts talking about these black alien beings with glowing red eyes that did something to him that froze him. And he was only able to start moving when he heard his dad's voice. And that's when these black alien beings left him alone. So he grabs his son, and everyone is freaked out at this point because his friends saw some strange lights in the sky. And now that both Chris and Chris's son are independently talking about these black beings with glowing red eyes, everyone just wants to get the heck out of there. So they jump in their car and they take off. And while they're driving, this orb returns and it starts following the car. And the people, everyone in the car is freaking out. And they see a house off the side of the road and they take off towards the house. And a man comes out with a shotgun and starts shooting the shotgun, not at them, but apparently at the orb that was chasing the car. And the orb takes off. And, then they're able to kind of get their wits about them, and they just can't believe what has happened to them. Now, Chris still can't account for the missing time. He has several hours of missing time, and he just has no story to tell other than there were these black, guys with glowing red eyes and this orb, and then he blacked out and woke up in a field. And then, of course, what happened to his son. So he goes and talks to his congregation, which was an evangelical congregation. And of course, they have absolutely no box for this. So they say, listen, you're lying. This doesn't happen. You have to be lying. You're just trying to get attention. And he becomes incredibly persecuted in his community, and his kids are, ridiculed in school. He had the misfortune of having one of the History Channel coming out and doing a show on him, and that just made things much, much worse for him. And his family was the pariah of the town, and it was horrific for them. And he just wished that none of this had ever happened. It was a curse. Meanwhile, his son can no longer sleep in his own bedroom. He sleeps on their floor because he's so freaked out. He drops out of high school because he's being relentlessly bullied as a result of this experience. And he starts drinking and doing drugs, as a coping mechanism for this. And the Bledsoe family is they're at their wits' end. Then, and to make matters worse, they now see orbs coming to their property all the time. And they also see these black aliens with glowing red eyes walking around their property and poking their heads around trees and stuff. And it's totally freaking them out. And one day, a tree in their backyard spontaneously bursts into flame. And Chris is just dumbfounded by this. And they take pictures of it, they film it, and they have no explanation. They try to put it out, and then it just bursts back into flames. And it makes no sense. And then this orb comes down from the heavens and hovers in front of Chris in his backyard above the lawn. And the orb gradually begins to fade. And inside of the orb, Chris sees this beautiful woman. And the woman is wearing this dress that appears to shine like it's made out of stars. And as he's staring at the woman, suddenly this big, powerful bull appears out of nowhere and charges Chris. And Chris falls down because on his back, he thinks he's about to be gored by this crazy bull. And the bull goes right over him. And as he looks up into the belly of the bull, he sees stars and constellations. And then the bull runs off and it's gone. It dematerializes. And then all that's left is this beautiful woman. And he said that the beautiful woman is kind of radiating a bluish glow. And Chris says that she's shockingly beautiful. And the woman begins to speak to Chris. And she starts saying crazy things to him about things that are going to happen on the earth. And Chris says, hey, time out. I want nothing to do with this, okay? Because he now remembers the missing time experience. And in the missing time experience, he was taken by this orb to what he described as being like the canyon lands in southern Utah, just red canyons. And he was taken to a place where he met this woman. And this woman was sitting upon this throne in these red canyons. And, the woman at that time told Chris that she was the ancient goddess of the ancient world, and that she had been worshipped by many names: Hathor, Ishtar, Asherah, and, in modern times as the Lady, meaning the lady of all these Marian apparitions. And Chris doesn't really know what to make of any of this. But, now we're in his backyard, and here she is again. And she starts prophesying to him of all of these things that are going to take place. She says there's going to be election interference in the upcoming election. There's going to be a large earthquake, and tells him the time and place of this earthquake that's going to take place. And she says, listen, I want you to tell people these things so that they can know that you're not lying. And Chris says, listen, I'm not telling anybody anything anymore, because ever since I talked about that event that happened by the Cape Fear River, my life has been a living hell. I'm not telling anybody anything more about this. And this woman said, I know that this has been difficult for you and your family. And I promise you that as of right now, things are going to get better. And in fact, to help you demonstrate to people that this is all real, apart from these prophecies that I'm giving you, I am also going to give you the power to heal people. And people won't be able to dispute that, because that is not normal. And then she told Chris something very crazy. She said that around Easter of 2026, the world will enter into the stage of the divine feminine, and that the world will be awakened to all kinds of new knowledge, and that it will change everything. And the very next day, a man from NASA shows up on Chris's doorstep and starts talking to Chris. And Chris tells him about all the troubles that he's been having. And he said, listen, we're going to nip this in the bud. I want you to gather everyone who has been hounding you and your family, and we are going to talk to them. And so Chris did that, and some guy from the Pentagon came and addressed all of the people that Chris invited. And the guy from the Pentagon told him, listen, the things that Chris experienced are absolutely real. The government knows about this. We've been tracking it for a long time. And you need to cut Chris and his family some slack, because he is involved in something very important in this. And then Chris said that he began to be treated like a VIP. People from the government started frequenting his house, and he began to be invited to all of these VIP things in Washington, D.C. And he said that he was invited by a prominent Jewish family to dinner, and actually to, I believe it was the bar mitzvah of their son, who had a terminal illness. Now, when Chris arrived at the house, the mother had heard about his experience, and she told Chris, listen, I want you to heal my son. And Chris said, well, the lady said I could heal, but I have no idea what's going on. And while he was saying that, he said that he was filled with what felt like an electrical charge. And he knew that if he just touched their son that the son would be healed. So he just went up and hugged their son. And from that moment on, the son has been totally healed of this terminal illness. And then he tells the story of dinner that he was at in Washington, where all kinds of senators and, who's who folks there. And this Jewish family was there. And while they were eating, an elderly fellow had a heart attack and just collapsed into his dinner plate. And this Jewish woman came up to Chris and said, I want you to go over and heal that man. And immediately, Chris feels this buildup of energy, just like he felt when he healed her son. And he went over and just put his hand on this man's shoulder that was completely non-responsive. And he immediately was healed. And everyone there at that dinner was witness to this. And since this event, Chris has become a who's who in Washington. In fact, he wrote a book called UFO of God. And the foreword of the book was written by the head of the CIA and saying, listen, everything that Chris is talking about is absolutely real. I know it's real because I've been to Chris's house. I've seen these things in person, and we've been following this. We know that this is real. And Chris went on. Chris said that he was invited by NASA to participate in a launch. And after the launch, they took him to a special warehouse. And he was informed that there had only been a few hundred people ever that had been invited inside of that warehouse. And the warehouse had all kinds of, interesting artifacts and things that demonstrate that NASA is fully aware of the fact that the Earth is being visited by extraterrestrial visitors. And Chris said, listen, why are you guys treating me so special? And the man from NASA that was, acting as his guide told him, because we are very aware of this phenomenon, but they are not communicating with us like they communicate with you. And we want to understand why. Now, friends, it's not my intention to summarize everything that Chris Bledsoe has ever said or thought or believed on this subject. I just bring this up because these are some interesting things that I believe are very relevant to this phenomenon. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Chris Bledsoe's experiences, I have included some links in the show notes to the book that he wrote, as well as to some additional interviews that he has given that will give you a little more background than what I have been able to give you. For my purposes, it's sufficient to say that Chris believes that these orbs represent spiritual entities. He also believes that this woman is a divine being, and that the woman herself claimed to be a divine being. In fact, as mentioned before, she claimed that she has been worshipped by every generation upon the earth as Asherah, Hathor, Ishtar, Diana, etc. The thing that is worth noting, and where I've now been going on for about an hour, I think it's about time to wrap this episode up, but there is much more that needs to be said on this topic, particularly referring to this female, quote, air quotes, deity that has been appearing to Chris Bledsoe. And Chris says that she appears to him almost every year around Easter and Christmas and gives him certain messages. And again, she is claiming that the world is going to enter into the age of the divine feminine, and that she is the divine feminine, and that this will happen around Easter of the year 2026. Therefore, friends, I'm going to dedicate the entire next episode to this woman and what I believe you need to know about her and how this reconciles with our faith. And I think that it is something that is critical for all of us to understand. And I have some very personal experience with this that I'll talk about in more detail in the next episode. So friends, I hope that this has been helpful. Again, The purpose of these episodes are not to convince you that what I am saying or talking about is true. It's simply to present these things to you so that you can consider them and look and see if there isn't a pattern here that helps you to make sense of what is going on in the world around us, because something definitely is going on. And we have two choices. We can stick our heads in the sand and ignore it, or we can try to analyze it and wrap our minds around it and reconcile it with our Judeo-Christian values so that we can be better prepared for the black swan events that are certainly on the horizon. And if Chris Bledsoe is correct, they may be at our very door. All right, I hope that you will join me again next time. And until then, keep seeking, and may God bless you in your efforts to find Him.
You have just finished an episode of the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production, hosted by Michael B. Rush. For show notes, transcriptions, and extras, please visit www.theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, click the share button icon and send it to your friends and family. This will help to ensure the continued publication of future content. Michael thanks you in advance for sharing and looks forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep seeking, for they that seek shall find.